So, Paul is a goon, and he's a runner. He may not look it, but he does run. Paul also is on Fitbit. How many people here have Fitbits? They're little crack devices, right? You look at it like, oh, I don't have enough steps, or my friend has too many steps, or whatever. So Paul was training for a marathon, and so when you have like the Weekend Warrior Challenge, and you challenge all your friends because you're like a jackass, and you know you're training for a marathon, the rest of us are just mortals, they get a little cranky because, like, you know, Paul suddenly has 40,000 steps, or 100,000 steps, or whatever. Everyone else has like 20,000. So Paul's marathon is coming up, or this is in the past. Imagine I'm telling the story in the past. I've had like half a cup of coffee from my hotel room, so I'm pretty cranky. So Paul's getting ready to run his marathon, and my wife and Noise are constantly in challenges for, what, you want me to use a proper name? No, just say. And yeah, exactly. It's a logical reference, not an absolute. So, anyway, so Paul's getting ready, and they decide, like, man, they are sick of losing. What? Bye. No. I love you, dear. Paul's getting ready to run the marathon, and Noise and Heidi decide, like, screw this guy. He's not going to win Fitbit the weekend that he runs his marathon, because he's been training for months. So out of spite, they're like, fuck this guy. So they decide they're going to walk a marathon and then some so that they can beat Paul, but they're going to do it like all stealthy. So Noise flies all the way across the country to Maryland. They turn off Bluetooth syncing on their phone so no one gets wise to it, and they go out on a 30-mile walk, and then like a grand reveal at the end of the day, after he's run his marathon, they're like, fuck you, Paul. So now the cute thing was,
this is true.
Every bit of this is true. So,
and the part about fucking with me at the end of the day, I was like, eat that. And then all of a sudden it's, you know, I had like so a marathon is about 55,000 steps with all the other stuff. I had 65,000 steps, and all of a sudden, boom.
So we made them badges for their Nonathon that they ran, and we felt bad that we didn't make one for Paul. So, Paul, here's your Nonathon 2015 Spiteful badge. And just so you know, at the end of the day, Heidi's Fitbit didn't register all the steps. She was like 5,000 short. So in order to make sure that she beat you, she put it on me, and I walked around my house in the dark at 10 o'clock at night until I had the right number of steps. I swear to God, before that they would upload it, I'm like walking around my yard. Can I come in yet? What's it at? 28,000. No! And I just keep on cruising.
Well, this is a great honor. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Thank you, Paul. All right, so you've come to DEF CON and you want touchy-feely talks about risk, apparently. So this talk was born out of rage. I remember, I don't exactly know what vulnerability it was, but I was sitting around some night and I was reading Twitter, which is generally a bad idea anyway, but some vulnerability had just been announced and everyone's like, oh, this is terrible, this is the end of the world, all kinds of, you know, skies falling, whatever, and it was some bullshit vulnerability, and I thought, man, we do a really lousy job of understanding and managing risk in this community. So I like kicked out like a rage RFP response or CFP response to DEF CON, like, screw this risk is important, whatever, and I sent it in and figured they would just throw it in the bit bucket, and instead it got accepted. So I have to go ahead and give the talk. There'll be a lot of stories here today. I start all my talks with the same basic premise, that you shouldn't believe anything I say, and that's a very general, broad statement, and I would encourage you to apply that mantra to every talk that you attend here at DEF CON or any other talk or any other conference. In particular, I have no degree, I have no certifications. I'm a straight-out college dropout of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Anyone go to UAF? Did you graduate? Yes. Holy shit, man, really? It was cold. Stating the obvious, the man says it's cold. That is the quality of the education you get from the state of Alaska. That's what's on the diploma. It's fucking cold. I'm also founder of the Shmoo Group and CTO of a place called the KeyW Corporation. The thing that gets me, I've been coming to DEF CON since DEF CON like 7, and I've been speaking since like DEF CON 8, which would tell you, the really frustrating thing is it's very easy to convince people that you know something, but it's very hard to actually know the thing, right? When I wanted to get into this industry, I fancied myself like really smart, and I knew a lot of shit, and I was going to tell people about it, but I really didn't know much, but I did have a desire to tell people. So in a desire to tell people shit, I decided I'm going to write a book. So I decided I wanted to write a book on 802.11 security. And I went to O'Reilly's website and downloaded the So You Want to Write a Book thing that they had. And you submit like an application to O'Reilly for a book idea. And the application is mostly marketing material, like who's going to buy it, why would they buy it, why wouldn't they buy it, what are the competing books in this space. Give us a brief outline that's like a page long, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll decide if we're going to give you some money to write a book. And so I send all this stuff into O'Reilly for 802.11 security, and they send back a FedEx package 3 weeks later. Congratulations, here's your contract, sign it, and you'll be an author and you can start writing the book. And I thought, oh shit, I need to start learning something about 802.11 security. Because I knew exactly nothing. I actually owned no wireless devices at the time. So it was like, I should go out and buy some cards and figure this out. And that's honestly a lot of what you read and a lot of what you hear are people getting these ideas and then getting up on stage and spouting like random shit. And you giggle, but it's true. You need to challenge everything that you hear at DEF CON and other events, because the people that are up here are motivated by all kinds of reasons, be it ego, be it business, all kinds of different things. This is, to be super clear, we get really grumpy about product pitches when people get up on stage here. But in reality, almost every person that gets on stage here sells a service. And that service comes out of their brain and their knowledge. When they get up here and they do cool shit and they look like rock stars, they get money for it, right? Consultants get rich by getting on stage to tell you things. So the motivation, while it looks altruistic, is oftentimes still economic. It's just like the product vendors. Don't think because we're on stage, we're not whoring ourselves out still. So there, I got a little ranty early, I'm sorry.
This talk is now canceled.
So I'm just killing time before questions. Anyway, and at the end of the day, you need to hold me and you need to hold everyone in the community accountable. There has been a lot of crazy bullshit that's happened in the community in the last couple of years, and there's very little bullshit calling going on. So my wife runs ShmooCon. I help her out with it. It's a conference in DC. Has anyone been to ShmooCon before? So it's a small-ish con, like 2,000 people. We sell out in like 20 some odd seconds. So we're unfortunate. Yeah, you just hit F5 until you get a ticket. It's annoyingly popular, is what I like to call it. But one of the reasons we started that con is because we were sick of coming to other cons and listening to people on stage spout total bullshit and nobody calling them out on it. So we decided we wanted to find a way to engage the audience better when they thought, man, this is bullshit, but I don't want to stand up and be that person, be like, I disagree. Because if you're 50 rows back in this talk and you stand up and say, I disagree, like, the spotlight's on you, man, and you better have a good reason for standing up and interrupting. So what we did instead is we armed everyone with squishy foam rubber balls, and we called them shmoo balls, and we encouraged the attendees to throw them at the speaker if you disagree. You have to inform the speakers of this ahead of time. Because they will get a little grumpy when projectiles start coming their way, kind of like, woo, like, this is kind of it. So it does turn into a little bit of Blues Brothers, which is good, though. And so I would encourage you with that mindset when you come to a talk like this. If you disagree, stand up and be that person and hold the person on stage accountable. When I gave my first talk at DEF CON, I swear to God, I was so nervous. I thought, the whole audience is going to stand up and call me out for being wrong on something, and it's going to be the worst thing that ever happened to me. Nobody called me out for anything. I've been called out like half a dozen times in the last 20 years, which is total bullshit, because I flat out lied about things just trying to get people to say something. And they don't. So, anyway, next. Fukushima. Just segue, like, let's talk about nuclear disasters now, because that's kind of what this talk has turned into. That was pretty good. Jokes are coming fast this morning. I'm feeling the meth is kicking in. I'm glad there's a camera here. So let's understand some situations where we failed to understand risk appropriately. The first one is Fukushima. So Fukushima Daiichi was the number one, that's how many fingers I need, number one reactor. What's up, Dan? Thank you. Excellent. It was a nuclear reactor in Japan. I think we're all familiar with the Fukushima incident. It's kind of a big deal. 9.0 earthquake, tsunami hits a nuclear reactor built on a cliff wall next to the ocean in an earthquake-prone zone. Question mark? Seems like a proper place. Like the settlers got there and like, well, there's nice fish here, but we should also maybe build a nuclear reactor. Oh, it's a great idea. As if Japan got settled. I know nothing of Japanese history, so I just invented Japanese settlers, by the way. So, they don't exist. Thank you. Jesus, that was some poor history going right there. Anyway, the interesting thing from a risk perspective for me was the report afterwards called the disaster man-made, right? And it wasn't because the tsunami was man-made, but there were a whole series of bad decisions that occurred before and during and after the earthquake that led to the meltdown of 3 cores of nuclear material and all kinds of nuclear material being released into the environment. Right? It was not because of the tsunami. It was because they didn't prepare, they didn't build it up to spec, they didn't have processes and procedures in place. And then when the incident happened, they continued to make bad decisions, mostly in the I think everything is okay mode, right? Like, I know that we released some steam that had radioactive material in it, but we could have released a lot more, so you should be happy, you know? Like, smiling happy, the Domocon's running around. How do you think they got Domocon? Not many people. Anyway, all right, next. So the Deepwater Horizon, another horrific incident that occurred. 11 people lost their lives. In 2009, Deepwater Horizon drilled the deepest well in history. 4,000 feet under the sea, they started drilling and went for another 7 miles until apparently they got to oil. I thought that's as big as the planet was. They would have got to China, but I was wrong. Again, really poor understanding of geography and history. But in 2010, the goddamn thing blew up, right? Killed 11 people, worst oil spill in the history of mankind. And again, this was largely their own doing. The reports and the judge that was involved found that there was a disregard for known risks. There was, just wanton, ridiculousness that was occurring. I don't think the judge used wanton ridiculousness, but that's my own trademark phrase. There were leaks. There was safety testing that wasn't done. They were way beyond the realm of reality when it comes to drilling this well and knowing that they wouldn't be able to cap it if anything went sideways in the bottom of the ocean. And it took months to clean up. And the whole time, BP saying I think 65,000 gallons are coming out a day. And everyone else, it's on the order of 1 million gallons of oil a day are coming out. We're 2 orders of magnitude away from each other. BP's no, it's not that much. The oil slicks you see in the Gulf today, coincidental. The tuna must have exploded and all the oil from the tuna came out, So BP, again, people all along knew that bad things were happening, but they didn't judge risks appropriately. People lost their lives and we're still cleaning up oil in the Gulf. Now, on the flip side of that discussion of Deepwater Horizon, I was standing in the Dunkin' Donuts one day during the oil spill. This goes somewhere. And there's these kids in front of me buying, they're 8 years old, and they're buying Turbo Hots, right? So a Turbo Hot is a cup of coffee with espresso in it, which is something an 8-year-old probably doesn't need. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say no. And this woman's in front of me, and she's shaking her head, and I'm kind of looking at her, and she's looking at me, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy. She's like, yeah, that is crazy. You know what else is crazy? And I'm like, I love sentences like that. I'm like, what? Please tell me what else is crazy. And she starts talking about the Gulf oil spill. I'm like, yeah, man, it's really bad. There's a lot of oil coming out. She's like, yeah. And then, but when the Gulf and everything around it collapses, it's going to be terrible. And I'm like, the Gulf and everything around it collapses, tell me more. So, in her mind, the Earth is like a layer cake. She explains this to me, that there is a layer of oil in the middle of the Earth that we're tapping into from all over the place. And all that oil, quote unquote, is going to come out from the Gulf, and then there'll be a big gap there, and the water will cause the Gulf to implode, and then a tsunami will wipe out everything. She was legitimately concerned in this Dunkin' Donuts that anytime in the next few days her life would end due to the Gulf of Mexico collapsing into the layer of oil that was no longer there. I'm not making any claims about Fox News here. Come on. But I'm like, you don't understand the risk either. It was amazing to me, like the lack of knowledge, her base understanding of the situation led her to make very poor risk decisions as she was about to go full-blown zombie apocalypse bunker mode because she was convinced the Gulf of Mexico was going to implode. It's not a thing, to be clear. For anyone else that had that Earth view, I'm sorry to have shattered it for you, but the Earth is not made of layer cake. Oh my God, I'm not even repeating you, man. Normally you repeat the question, but that was just dumb. Sorry, Todd. So the other side of the coin, the Takata airbag recall. Anyone had their car fixed yet for Takata? Handful of folks. Let's look at this. So Takata knew about the defects in their airbags in 2004, and they tried to cover it up. There is documented evidence that they were doing tests after hours to try to figure out how bad this was, so that it wasn't on the books, so that if they wouldn't force a recall, they wouldn't have to spend all this money to rebuild all these new airbags and all that kind of stuff. 34 million cars ultimately affected by this recall, and that number continues to grow. Am I being transcribed in real time for DEF CON? Wow, that's cool, and I apologize for the actual F-bombs that show up in words. Is there indiscernible parts? Wow. I will try to speak with more enunciation and discernibility. I'm going to watch myself over there now. You can all go, because I am enamored with that technology right there. La, la, la. Let's see it. Oh my God, I've never lost it like this before. I love you, other person. This is why you wake up at 10 o'clock to go to talk at DEF CON, to be super clear. All right, so, woo, math. The math behind the Takata recall. So this is based in, get serious, Jesus Christ. Is this a Turing test? Holy shit. Oh my God. I'm going to be dehydrated from crying. All right, so the number of cars on the roads in the year in the U.S. This is made-up numbers that I Googled, so you can disagree with it. Number of cars on the roads in the U.S., about 250 million. Number of accidents per year, about 5 million, give or take. It's really hard to find numbers about specifics of how severe accidents are and how often airbags are deployed. Back in the 80s and 90s, when people were worried that airbags were killing us and causing cancer, there were a lot of good statistics around airbag deployment, but anymore it's not something that's tracked as well as we would like. So let's say, for the sake of argument, 100% of the crashes out there involve a Takata airbag. So the number of Takata airbags potentially that occur every year in the United States that are involved in a deployment is 250,000. Okay, you can read this math. I'm not going to go through it real heavily, but I've gone through it a number of times. So it's about 250,000 Takata airbags a year are deployed due to crashes. Now, the neat thing is, not all Takata airbags are shit. And as it turns out, the vast majority of them work as designed. So according to testing, on average, you'll have between 0.04% and 0.08% of the airbags deploy and blast shrapnel into the face of the person who is involved in the accident. So let's say that that's 188 people a year, give or take, given my math. So of that 250,000 people, 188 of them are actually hit in the face with shrapnel. Now, unfortunately, some of those people die anyway. right? So the shrapnel in the face isn't that big of a deal because they caught a guardrail through the chest. And that's the reality of car crashes, right? Like, people freaking die. This feels like the start of Fight Club, right? Yeah. So, let's say 100 people a year are blasted in the face with shrapnel in the United States due to the Takata airbag deployment problem, right? And that's worst case. Like, I have been totally bad at the math here and presuming worst case scenario for all possible things here. So 100 people, probably less, affected by this. It results in the largest recall in automotive history, costing easily over $1 billion. Easily over $1 billion. People losing their jobs. There are all kinds of money being spent on this that doesn't need to be spent, hurts the economy, whatever. Is preventing 100 injuries a year worth $1 billion? I don't know. Like, I'm not up here to make the claim that it is or it isn't, but when we make decisions about, like, the largest recall in automotive history, and we see people getting drug up in front of Congress, and Congress critters berating them about, like, hey, your airbags are killing babies, or whatever the hell's going on. To be clear, your baby should not be strapped in a seat with an airbag. The question doesn't come up, well, it's only 100 people, and we're going to spend $1 billion on it. Doesn't make sense, because that does not get your ass reelected, as it turns out. What could we do to save lives with $1 billion that isn't replacing Takata airbags, right? 500 people a year die from TB, die from tuberculosis in the United States. I bet you $1 billion would help those people. 500 people a year die from accidental gunshot wounds. 40,000 people a year die from suicide in the United States. I assure you, $1 billion would go a long way to suicide prevention in the U.S. And I feel really bad to say that 100 people that get hit in the face with Takata shrapnel, hey man, I feel bad about the shrapnel, but for you getting hit in the face, 100 people died from killing themselves. Sir? Well, certainly. So the comment is it's about brand protection for Honda and other organizations that have been affected by this. Because no car company wants to come out and say, nah, not important. Like, General Motors is not going to stand up and like, I know you guys are doing something about this. We're just choosing not to, right? Because people are going to be like, I am not buying a GM, right? And so everybody else is doing it. All the brands have to do it. So it is absolutely about brand protection. It is not about what we think it's about, which is saving lives and stopping people from getting hurt. Did they? Well, that was the ignitions. That was a different problem. That was people with too heavy keys. But anyway, so I've been running around here giggling at the transcriber. I should probably talk about risk in some meaningful way. So, really, what the hell is risk? So the question, we use the term a lot, but it's really hard to wrap your head around, like, what specifically is a risk? I get this question a lot. So I do, like, commercial consulting, and I help kind of arm people to make better risk decisions. And they'll come to me quietly in the corner like, I don't know what an actual, like, risk is. Like, I know things are bad, and bad things can happen, but what does risk actually mean? So in the abstract, different organizations have different views of risk, right? A bank, it's a situation where loss of funds or profit can occur. Manufacturing is where IP can get lost, whatever. In general, if something you care about is put in harm's way, it's a risk, right? We'll get more specific in a minute, but I don't want you to get mired down in a bunch of real mechanical views of risk. I want you to be thinking kind of abstract right now. I want to level set on some terms, technical versus business risk. So there's things that can be bad to us, that can hurt IT, that can hurt engineering efforts and that kind of thing, but don't necessarily have an impact to the business in any kind of material way. That's a technical risk. A business risk is something that impacts business operations that the front office would care about when they look at all the things that go on across the organization. Like, this is a risk, it has material impact on my line of business. That's a business risk. Another phrase you'll hear is inherent risk versus residual risk. Inherent risk is there's this bad thing that can happen. Residual risk is now I have a compensating control, and the likelihood of that bad thing has been reduced by some amount, right? So inherent risk is I build a system, it's full of freaking holes, people could own it. The inherent risk is I take some compensating controls, I patch a bunch of things. Now the residual risk is much, much less. You hear these terms bantered around a lot, and it's just important to know the specificity specificity that you need to use these terms. I'm not going to use them at all again today, which I know may disappoint some of you, but it makes me happy because I hate having these kind of discussions. You just need to understand there are different types of risks that organizations care about. I am scratching the surface here. There is a very deep rat hole that you can go down, and we are not going to go down it. There are a bunch of risk frameworks out there. So has anyone had to use NIST 830 before? Yeah, was it fun? It's a good time? Good times. Those risk management frameworks are good times. No, they're not. There are a lot of frameworks out there. The NIST 800 framework has gone through revision. There was 830 and there's 830 R1. It's actually decent in the sense that there's a concrete process you can walk through and you don't have to pay for it. That's your tax dollars at work, getting you something that you can do to materially go and implement a risk management program. Some of these other frameworks that exist out there through ISO and COBIT and things like that, you get to pay money to use. The NIST stuff is all free. And you may not agree with it, but it's a decent starting point. The NIST cybersecurity framework, so I was involved in the creation of that. Did anyone attend the cybersecurity workshops that they had around the country? Probably not. So NIST went out. One person in the back. Hello, sir. Do you remember me from such things as the NIST cybersecurity framework workshops? Yeah, he was there. Okay, he's like, yeah, whatever. That's legit. Get the guy. Yeah, anyway. So the NIST cybersecurity framework is interesting because they were very concerned. So this is actually a mandate that the president gave NIST to create some sort of framework that companies and the public sector could use in order to try to measure and have a kind of a common view of how they thought about cybersecurity risk. So in the State of the Union in 2013, he got up on stage and said, hey, NIST, you're going to do this thing. And NIST said, oh, shit. And what they did is they went out and they held all these workshops with critical infrastructure people from transportation, healthcare, finance, that kind of thing, and said, what do you do today when it comes to risk management? And there was just this flow of information to NIST, and NIST had to synthesize it down to come up with a cybersecurity framework. Now, the interesting thing that NIST was very concerned about in the creation of the CSF is they didn't want it to be something that you did. And you may ask, why? Well, it's because they wanted to make sure that they weren't creating something that government agencies would be held accountable and responsible to doing and therefore then creating regulation, right? There's a concern in organizations like NIST that you create de facto regulation when you come up with a way of doing things and specific hurdles that you need to jump over. Because everyone will point to that and say, you need to do that. And so NIST was very cautious. Has anyone read the CSF? Anyone, a handful of people? It's an interesting document, and I'm going to touch on it more in a minute. But if you read it, the one takeaway you'll have the first time is like, I don't know what to do, right? And that's on purpose. That is 100% on purpose from the CSF. So you're not alone, but there are ways to operationalize it. There's CyberVAR. So VAR is this idea of value at risk. Like, I stand to lose something of value. How much of it would I lose if this event happened? And so in certain domains, like financial, manufacturing, things like that, we have hard metrics around how much I would lose if a bad thing happened, right? Banks are great. Banks are risk management machines. Why are there safes? To keep people from stealing the money. When the safes are good enough, people stop stealing money from the safe and they just start shooting the teller instead, right? You know, you push the risk somewhere else. So that was kind of, sorry, that was a little morbid. But the banks are very good at understanding risk and putting in controls. That safe is a control because there's a dollar amount they can assign to the loss of the stuff inside the safe, which coincidentally is exactly the same dollar amount as the amount of money inside the safe. Like, it's a very easy linear connection that you can make. In cyber, and I'm going to use the word cyber, and fuck you if you don't like it. Thank you. Yes, there's a few of us that believe that cyber is an okay thing to use outside of IRC. So. This talk is canceled. I've been canceled twice. Jesus. ASL? No one uses IRC anymore. ASL got it, like 8 people giggle, and we're all on lists. So, for those that don't know, ASL means age, sex, location, and when you, anyway, all right, whatever. I don't know who I'm talking to anymore. So, CyberVAR Cybervar is a way to, an attempt to assign value to bad things happening in cyberspace. So it's much more of a structured approach. What am I going to lose? How much am I going to lose? What's the likelihood? It's very math-driven. And math is cool. It's okay. I'm down with it. Gabe Bassett, if you want to follow him on Twitter, does some interesting stuff in this area where he's doing large-scale graph analysis of all these bad events that can occur and stuff. I mean, it's really fascinating. But it's not all that pragmatic for people like us. Like at the end of the day, when I walk into an organization and I have like the CISO pulling me aside going, I'm not really sure what risk is. Like I'm like, well, you don't need a lot of fucking metrics. Like I'm just gonna tell you that right now. Like you don't need to go do graph analysis, okay? We're not gonna start there. That's advanced. It's like 202 or 203 level kind of stuff. There's also things like NIST 853, COBIT, ISO, which are control frameworks that if you kind of squint, you can turn into risk management frameworks. I want you to be topically aware of these things. You don't need to be intimately familiar with them, but if you're going to take my presentation later and look for a starting point, Googling these things is a good place. We kind of have our own risk framework in a manner of speaking, and it's a very quantified one. So the CVSS system, which is how we score vulnerabilities, or we, National Vulnerability Database and MITRE, score vulnerabilities. It's an open standard that attempts to define the severity of a vulnerability on a scale of 0 to 10, right? And so there's 14 different metrics that all get rolled together, and you assign number values to all these things, and then you pop out a number out the back end. So if you've looked at a CVE, you'll see, there's all this information about the vulnerability itself, and then underneath they'll have impact where they have the CVSS scores. This was one random, as the first Apache hit that I found this morning, and you see the base score, the impact, and the exploitability score. So the impact and exploitability basically get composed into the base score. And there's a freaking number, man. A high resolution number. Okay, how many different values are there between 0 and 10 when you go to the 10th place? 100 values of risk in the CVSS. That is way fucking too many. You need 5, maybe. So, wow, that was the voice of God getting all pissed off at CVSS this morning. Dropping F-bombs about CVSS. I feel passionate about some crazy shit, you might be thinking. That's what I was thinking, actually. So it turns out like you're giving people way too much to contemplate when you have 100 different levels of how bad something is, right? But it feels good because it's math, right? Like math feels good. Like simple arithmetic feels good. Like linear algebra was a horse's butt. But a few of you that took linear was like, yeah, that was bullshit. And then discrete, fuck that noise. And the liberal arts majors are like, what's math? I'm a college dropout. I can say these things. Okay. So in the CVSS, there's also the CWSS. So just replace the V with a W, and it turns out it's actually a little more interesting. CVSS is all about specific concrete vulnerabilities. Like you have to have a vulnerability in order to assign it a score. In this one with weakness, you can just have like the concept of a vulnerability, a weakness. Like this thing may happen, it may be there, and if it was there, how bad would it be? And so the CWSS is a little bit more abstract. Still gives you a number, still a little high on the resolution of that number, but it's, I think, in a very interesting way of trying to think about bad things that might happen. Because vulnerabilities are bad things that are pretty much going on, right? So let's talk about vulnerability disclosure for a few seconds because I feel like it. So I feel pretty passionately about the release of information regarding vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And when I say that, I mean, I think that the release of that information should benefit the end user as much as humanly possible. And disclosing that information to third parties like security product vendors usually just makes those security product vendors richer and doesn't necessarily make the end user safer. Okay? And in particular, there's been some very interesting studies that say ODAs that are being exploited by a limited number of people or potentially no one up until the point of disclosure have a very small blast radius of people they harm. Once the vulnerability is disclosed and the patch is out, people that write the bad stuff can very quickly weaponize that and put it out there and start doing bad things to everyone all at once. So the disclosure of the vulnerability is usually the tipping point in which bad things happen due to that vulnerability. So, wow, I don't even know. Like, I was ramping up and I fell right off. It was like that drone. It just went pow right at the bottom there. Damn it. At the end of the day, I get really cranky about the third-party exploit sales that go on in this industry, like really, really, really cranky. Makes me grumpy, because it doesn't do anything to protect the end user, right? And so when we think about vulnerability in this day and age, when you're looking at a CVE, that CVE means bad things are happening right now due to that thing. CWSS and the whole system that MITRE has around weaknesses is us thinking proactively about bad things that might happen in the future, which is way more interesting and useful, right? Because if my leg's already been sawed off, like there's not much I can do to reattach it, but if the other leg is about to be cut off, I can probably like stop the zombie with a shotgun or something. So zombies wield chainsaws in my dreams. So just to be super clear about that psychosis. Okay, so we've talked a lot about it. Why is risk important to hackers? That was a ton of acronyms, and I apologize. I felt important that you get exposure to it. It turns out in our community, when we measure risk inappropriately, on either side, like I am on the Deepwater Horizon going, everything's okay, or I'm in Dunkin' Donuts saying the world is going to collapse because all the oil is leaking out, both of those things make you look bad, right? To be clear, and in our world, when the latest vulnerability is released, and we write blog posts and things that say the sky is falling when it's really not, or we say, oh no, everything's cool, you know, ISIS is just a bunch of JV basketball players. Oops, no, they're not. Turns out they've got their own country now. You know, these are things that the people that say them don't look good because of them, and bad things can happen as a result of mishandling risk. So it's time. Really? I have 10 minutes? Holy balls! Gotta go. Time to simplify. So all these frameworks that are out there, I think, are interesting, but there's still no answer to the question, what specifically is a risk? And so when I think of risk and I think of threat, I can have 15. You just didn't have an extra 5 fingers to show me? I got 2. You got 3. We're close. We have I think, 13 minutes left now. So when I think of these things, I like to have kind of a concrete syntax in which to think about risk and threat. This is of my own doing, okay? When you Google this, you will find me, and that's pretty much it. So if you disagree with this, feel free to throw some stones. But I've used these models before in the past, and they've worked very well for me when I've worked with my clients and worked on different projects. So I would like to encourage you to think about using them. So the risk syntax is there's a likelihood that some cause will result in impact. I'll get into this in a little bit more specific here in a second. The threat is actor does action to asset for outcome because motivation. We'll get into all this in just a minute, so just buckle up, it's okay. And a vulnerability is really just a weakness that can be exploited. I'm going to walk through a concrete example of this so you can see. So when someone asks you, what do you think a risk is, you may not like this, but you can at least point to it and say, this is what a risk is. So here's a risk. It is highly likely that an attacker will gain access to our database server, leading to loss of all personal information in the database and heavily damaging our brand. So looking at the syntax that I proposed, here's the likelihood, right? It is highly likely. It even has a word likely in it. That is the likelihood. Here is the cause. An attacker will gain access to our database server. And then here is the impact. We will lose our shit, right? I like this is kind of fancy, the colors in the background and everything. I thought it was very nice. Visually, it popped for me. So hopefully you all enjoyed it. That was like the big poof of my entire presentation. Threat, the same deal. We have actors. We have actions. We have assets, and we have outcomes. Now, if you were paying attention, which I hope you weren't, but earlier in the syntax of threat, I also had the word motivation. I have clients that I deal with that care about the motivation of the people attacking their systems, and I have clients that just could give a shit, right? Because bad guys are doing bad things, and haters gonna hate, and they just don't really care why. So I oftentimes, when I go through threat modeling and do this threat process, will not include motivation because it ends up not being important, all right? So when we, first of all, if you want to learn more about threat modeling, go Google my talk from DerbyCon on threat modeling. I walk through a very concrete process in which to model threat. It's the easiest way. I'm not going to put goddamn URL. There's a URL on a freaking PowerPoint slide. Do you ever write it down? Or do you just think, I'll Google that shit? So I'm just encouraging you to Google that shit and not going to actually provide you with a link because it's it involves Iron Geek's website and a huge long line of expletives because I put shit and screw you in the talk. Anyway, all right. I swear a lot. I did not swear at all at my Black Hat talk, so I'm just making up for it right now. I'm just dropping F-bombs with wanton disregard. That's that term again. Anyway, Jesus. So here's a specific example. So there's this high-level risk, it's really likely that people are going to break into our stuff and they're going to steal all the information that we care about. Why? Well, there are external actors that can go do SQL injection. There are insiders who can log into stuff. There are nation states that want to backdoor our things. And we have these specific vulnerabilities, right? So the vulnerabilities and threats are all composed up into this risk statement that you can take and hand to people that don't really understand the technical piece, but they can understand, like, oh, there's bad guys that are going to get into our database and steal our stuff. Like, I can appreciate that as a risk, right? This taxonomy of risk, threat, and vulnerability is something that I think works pretty effectively at communicating risk in our domain. And again, this isn't something that is documented in a NIST standard or something like that. This is like what I've learned from trial and error. And again, you may not like this, or you may disagree with it, or it may not work for you, but keeping it simple when talking about risk and having clear distinction around risk, threat, and vulnerability, I think is important. It's also important in how it gets composed, right? So in 2002, NIST 830, when he said, hey, how do we measure risk, they actually had an equation: vulnerability times likelihood times impact, right? So how likely is this thing to happen? What's the impact going to be, and how severe is the vulnerability? You compose it together, and you come up with a number or something, I guess, right? Well, as it turns out, they thought, well, that was a little too simple, so we'll come up with something a little more complex, because risk is nuanced, right? And so this is stolen from NIST 830 R1 from 2012. I will say they are not the same thing, right? This is a much more complex view of risk. I'm not saying the 2012 publication is wrong. I'm just saying it's a much more complex view. And if you're trying to sink your teeth into risk for the first time, I might encourage you to read the older documentation first. And that will help you understand the newer documentation, which is a much more complex thing. Now, or 37, or, yeah, you were familiar with in this series, sir. Like, it's head nodding. He may be a Fed. He does have, oh, you're black badging it, though. Is that a black badge, sir? No? The old human. Why is it black? They had black human badges one year? This year they had black human badges? Jesus Christ, man, tell me what's happening. Cats and dogs living together. All right. So the NIST scale, I think, is interesting as far as looking at likelihood. They have 5. Like I said, you only need 5 numbers. You don't need 100, right? Almost certain, highly likely, somewhat likely. These are, like, relatively subjective, but risk is freaking subjective, so just pick 5. I think what's very interesting is one of the guys I work with had this model, and he said, I only need 3. And specifically, high likelihood is it's happening to us already, or happening to companies that look like us in our vertical. Medium is it's happening to companies in other verticals, but not happening near us. And low is it's just not freaking happening, man. Like, because those are really the 3 states of shit that it can be in. Happening really close, happening far away, or not happening at all. But I like that model, sir. If he let me use his real name, I'd put it on it, but he won't. So that model is very interesting. So we went from 5 to 3. We're making it even simpler. Impact is same thing. You need 5. You don't need 100. Okay? So very high. You can read the goddamn slides, right? This is a great part of the NIST risk stuff, because it's very simple. It's very low resolution. 5, pick one and run with it. So when you compose all these things together, you can take NIST, you can take these kind of simple risk statements and threat statements, and you can start to compose them through a process. Now, before I get to the process that you can go through, I do want to look at what happens why do we make bad risk decisions, and a few bad risk decisions we have made in our world. Misunderstanding any of those nouns leads to a bad risk decision. If you don't understand the assets that you have, if you don't understand the likelihood of event occurring because you don't know the threat actor space and what state of the art is with respect to attack, if you don't understand the complexity of an action and how hard it is to exploit something, you will make bad risk decisions. So in order to be good at risk management and understanding risk, the one kind of bummer of a side thing is you need to kind of be almost an expert in a lot of stuff. Right? You need to know a little bit about a lot in order to make good risk decisions. And that's kind of hard, because we oftentimes in our industry, we tend to highly specialize, especially early in our careers. I'm a vulnerability analyst, or I reverse engineer shit, or I'm a network security guy, or whatever. And that means that you don't get the broad visibility you need in order to make good risk decisions, right? There are consultants, like big, expensive consultants that do risk management all the time. You think those guys are paid way too much goddamn money, and that's probably true. But at the end of the day, these guys get paid money to know, a little bit about a lot. so they can make good decisions around risk. So when we look at things like Deepwater Horizon, or we look at things like Fukushima, you can look at situations where, like Fukushima, you didn't really understand the likelihood of a tsunami. You didn't understand the impact it would have when you built it on the side of the goddamn cliff wall in the ocean. There's things, basically, their freaking fuel tanks, the reserve fuel tanks, were washed out to sea, right? Like the engines were still there. They could have run the cooling systems, except all the diesel ended up somewhere in the Pacific. That's not hard to model. They're basically big bobbers with diesel fuel in them, right? Like, it floats. Diesel fuel floats on water, right? Question mark? Yeah. So even when it's full, it floats. And when it's half empty, it super floats, man. It's like a boat. You can put an oar on it and go across. These are not things you would like to put near the ocean to keep the nuclear power plant secure, safe. No, bad idea. Conceptually, that's not hard for us to think about. But somehow, the people that built Fukushima and Daiichi was like, yeah, that makes total fucking sense. They misunderstood a few of these nouns, and it had catastrophic impact on Japan. So let's imagine a vulnerability, if you will, that requires you to man in the middle, the victim. Every single attack, or every single TCP session needs to be man in the middle. And even after you man in the middle of the attack, I have to spend a lot of time post-processing the connection in order to decrypt what was inside of it to see if there's anything inside of it that was of value. Okay? How would we rate this? Sir? Oh, 5 minutes, yes. 6 minutes. Excellent. I always get a spare minute. That's the DEF CON good mantra for Bruce. I would say if I must actively man in the middle you, that is a very unlikely thing to occur, right? Of all the connections that I've ever committed on the internet in the last 20 years, I would say very, 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 very few of them have been man in the middle, right? The vast majority of that, it's kind of hard to man in the middle people, especially at scale. Like there are places, I don't know, like the DEF CON network, or maybe you could do it. But for the most part, in most enterprise networks, it's pretty hard. They may do it on purpose, but for outside attackers, it's quite difficult. And then you have to do it for every TCP session. You have to do a non-trivial amount of post-processing. And I don't even know what I got until I've done the decryption and the post-process and spent all this time. So there may have been a credit card number, or there may have been like kitties. Like I have no idea what was inside of that. SSL everywhere means I have to decrypt everything in order to find your credit card numbers. And if I got to spend $100 for every TCP session to find your credit card numbers, I'm going to be a poor, goddamn organized crime member. So how would you rate this? Do you agree with this rating? Very low, like incredibly unlikely that this to happen? Anyone know which one this was? Close. It was Freak. Same damn thing. Yeah, this is Freak. This was the Freak vulnerability, right? This made the news. Y'all read about Freak? Actively man in the middle and spend money to decrypt it, but oh my God, export crypto is bad. So we scored it at CBS as a medium, as a 4.3, somewhere decidedly in the middle, right? Anyone ever executed a Freak attack? Anyone been compromised by a Freak attack? Excellent. Why the fuck do we care, right? Serious, like, I think this is actually the one that caused me to like have the aneurysm and submit this talk. Like, this is total bullshit, right? We care a lot about SSL. Sir.
Right? I agree with you. Recognize that what can happen is that you work on this and develop it further, and maybe it won't cost as much the post-process. Now, the man in the middle, you're absolutely right, but that might be why.
So yeah, there are situations where in the future maybe it'd be different. It's not different now, therefore I don't care. Look, I mean, we can argue, again, like when it's a 43, you can argue it should be a 42, should be a 41, should be a 45. When it's high, medium, low, very low, whatever, I can certainly like say, like, we can all disagree this is like low to very low. Okay, cool, sweet. It doesn't even make the cut, doesn't hit my Nessus scans. Fuck that. No. So let's talk about PCI for a second. And so this is the other thing. There's a huge amount of requirement for PCI levied upon organizations to be PCI compliant, right? PCI is all about managing risk with credit cards, right? Well, hey, whoa. So, as it turns out, Heartland, Target, Home Depot, totally PCI compliant. They must not have got owned because they were managing risk appropriately. No, they were checking boxes appropriately. Someone else had measured risk years ago and said, PCI, this looks like something that we should do to protect credit cards. There wasn't a lot of fraud at the time that we developed PCI. We didn't really have a lot of art. And so they developed a checklist that people had to stick through hell and high water. God damn it, you got to have the right key size. because we don't want nation states compromising your credit cards. Like, go crack me a 1024-bit key. Like, bring it on. I'll wait. Right. So anyway, but we get inundated with PCI violations all the fucking time, right? You have weak key sizes. No, I don't really for the stuff that I care about. 1024 is fine. Like, oh my God, drives me nuts. People will actually complain. So for the ShmooCon website, we have people send us like, oh, here's the PCI checklist, and I'm going to report you to the PCI Council. First of all, when you report people to the PCI Council, you know what happens? Nothing! Like, not a goddamn thing. Secondarily, show me the threat actor. Show me the actual risk for me not having a strong enough key size to clear, I don't know, like 500 credit card transactions a year. It doesn't exist. Fuck you. So, wow. All right, so it's like time to wrap up. So, I have a day job, or I did. I may be applying for a new one. So what? So let's real quick operationalize it. When you want to operationalize risk, when you want to go through a process, again, 830 I think is a reasonable place to start. Here's a complicated box with lots of boxes and lines. I will spare you the first step. Don't worry about all this shit. It's not important, right? So I'm simplifying your risk management program right now, okay? Just do step 2 and throw the horns. How are you doing? Fine! Identify threat sources and events. Pick a threat modeling process. Use mine, use ShowStacks from Microsoft, use something, but use a structured process to try to get coverage of the threat landscape. There's one thing I haven't talked about, and I feel kind of bad, but it's important to not use your own personal bias to think about what's bad. Right? You need coverage of the landscape in order to understand what's actually bad and not what your own bias is because you got owned or some other company got owned in some way in the past. Formal processes, like what ShowStack has published, give you coverage of the threat landscape and allow you to appropriately threat model outside of your own body of knowledge. That is very important so that your system isn't protected about only the things that you care about, but the things that are real. Okay? The same comes when you're going through and identifying vulnerabilities. There are formalized processes to perform architectural assessments, code review, pen testing, all that kind of stuff that get you the coverage. That's what annoys the shit out of me about pen testing, right? There's not a lot of coverage. I found holes and I got in and I'm a fucking rock star, but all I did was some theatrics about getting in, and it doesn't help you understand the breadth of the risk in your organization. Sorry to break it to you, but you need to do more than pen testing to identify vulnerabilities. And then finally, use some common sense to determine how to address it. How likely it is to occur. What's the state of the art of the attack space? And then go figure out how bad it would be and then determine the risk associated with it. This is common sense in a bunch of boxes from NIST. And it turns out this is what most organizations need to do to manage risk appropriately. That's freaking it. When you look at the breadth problem, like how wide is wide, the NIST CSF core is actually pretty cool because it's like all things security in an Excel spreadsheet, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And they got little subdomains underneath it. That's like what we do. Your job fits into that bucket somewhere. That's the coverage that you need to have when you think about risk. So I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to, do I have time for questions or one? No time for, yes, I did no time for questions. In general, you need to, wow, I got 1 minute left, so I'm going to wrap it up.
This does not mean 1 minute.
No, it does not mean one. All right. So in general, I do want to encourage you. This has been a little ranty, and I apologize. But I get fired up about things like this because when I see us as a community making bad decisions, when the roadmap of success is super clear to me, like people have gone down this road, we don't need to reinvent it. Go please leverage previous processes, leverage prior art, and make better things happen. Don't be part of the problem, be part of the solution. Okay, that's it. Got to go. Bye.